All right, welcome friends, colleagues, students, citizens of the world. It's your boy LeRoy Horton coming back at you with another episode of the Teach Me Implant podcast. And I know I sometimes say this, I almost always mean it when I say it, but this is one of those days where I absolutely mean what I'm about to say. But I have been blessed, truly blessed with knowing some of the most amazing people walking this earth right now. And as I've promised, I'm only bringing you the best of the best, and today I have absolutely lived up to that promise. I got my boy Jerome Hunter in the house. What's going on, my man?
Hey man, another day. I am humbled and honored to be here. Excited to have this conversation and just a joy and a pleasure to know you. I wish I could, share with the world how many moments we've had together and how much you've impacted and inspired me along the way. So happy to be here.
Well, I appreciate that, man. We've come a long way from, you know, I won't say stalking, walking the streets of Belltown, on a Friday, Saturday night,
Yeah.
both when, while we were still students and bright-eyed, bushy-tailed. We had a general plan, and that plan has evolved and perfected more and more as we've aged.
Hmm.
But I do want to point out, we knew you were going to be an educator at the time because you had expressed that that was your goal. But you've transcended that. And I have had such a good time watching you from afar. And I always tell everybody, some of my best friends, I don't see that often because they're busy, whether it's their family life, their professional life, their personal endeavors and goals. And as long as I can watch you, I don't mind if we don't hang out for a year or two. You know what I mean? Because I just love seeing your journey and am proud that and honored that you allow me to be in that circle to watch what you do. So why don't you tell us, you went from being an educator in a public school system
Hmm.
to founding or co-founding your own academy.
Yeah.
Walk us through that.
Yeah. So education to me is a form of activism. And the way that I see education is it's either a tool for change or it's perpetuating the status quo. And so when I got into education, I was really looking to remove and dismantle barriers that held folks, students specifically, furthest away from educational justice, away from opportunity. And I wanted to focus on providing an educational experience that not only reflected the culture and diversity of the students that were at the schools, but also be a champion for their holistic growth. And so what I found was when I was teaching at the middle school level in the public school system, there were always conversations around high flyers or snowflakes, and those are euphemisms for students who might not be doing as well as the teachers expect them to do. And the patterns and trends always showed black and brown boys. And when I saw these patterns and trends, I couldn't help but to think of my own experience in school. And the experience that I had was also being reflected in the experience that these boys were having, where there's a limited amount of teachers of color. There's even a slimmer amount of male teachers of color. And so there were limits of representation. And there's something to be said about representation. It's not everything, but it's really important because if students see something, it's kind of the old saying, if I can see it, I can be it. And so if they're not seeing themselves reflected in the classroom or the curricula, it's almost expected that they're going to feel as if the education isn't meant for them. It isn't preparing them for their experiences to grow into who they want to be. And so I took it upon myself to leverage my experience and my understanding of education. Are we okay to do like hot takes on here?
Absolutely.
So, um, my hot take on education in general um, is that if you go back to the 1920s and read up on eugenics, there's an entire movement to standardize assessments that fit the status quo, and that's kind of a soft version of white supremacy. And that's, these standardizations are made to reduce potential, to rank label, and manage behavior. And we see a lot of that today in traditional school system. And oftentimes that perpetuates a crisis that we aim to prevent. We call it the pipeline, the prison, school to prison pipeline, where there's a lot of behavior management and disproportionate disciplining. So from that hot take, I wanted to change the way we looked at education, less from a deficit lens and more from an asset-based lens. So instead of looking at these black and brown boys as an issue or trying to prevent an issue, because if we don't prevent something, they're going to immediately cause trouble, which I don't believe is true, is to think about it from an asset-based lens. We understand that we all make mistakes, and instead of approaching our interactions as educators with black and brown boys as what's their problem or what's wrong with them, my take was, how do we acknowledge what's already right and build from there? And I think the school that I founded was based on that, and it was specific to black and brown boys, but not exclusive to them, because I think it's important for a diverse population of students to coexist, share the codes of learning, and also learn from diverse perspectives. And oftentimes what you see in traditional schools is that student groups start to silo themselves and it becomes groupthink. And I think if there's too much groupthink, that can distort one's reality. And so in addition to, presenting a experiential learning curriculum to these boys at the school, it was also to provide diverse interpersonal experiences that can broaden their experiences and understandings of themselves, but also the world that they're engaging with.
Right. Now, when you say something like white supremacy, right, or white privilege, it often has the connotation that if you're not a person of color, life is easy. So you end up, or the receiver of that, especially when you're talking to persons that that are Caucasian or white, tends to be like a defense mechanism because they've had their traumas and their struggles as well, and they feel like you're minimizing it. And I've struggled with that conversation because if you take the time and you say, listen, no one's saying your life was easy across the board because of this.
Right.
But because you are the status quo, your problems are the generic problems that we all have, to one degree or another. But then there's these added factors that a person of color or a person that grew up in a foster home or a person that's, has a different identity, right? How have you been able to communicate these concepts with either students and or parents who, when you start using language that, and you've seen all those interviews where they talk to, maybe a Trump supporter and they say, oh, I hate that critical race theory. And you're like, well, what's critical race theory? Well, I don't really know, but I just know I don't like it.
Yeah.
How do you navigate those spaces?
Delicately and with grace. I think there's oftentimes a knee-jerk reaction on the I guess progressive side that understands these terms and it maybe can intellectualize them. And then there's also a knee-jerk reaction on, I guess, the other side of the spectrum. When they hear it, they get defensive. And so it creates an immediate binary. And so my goal when talking about systems of oppression or systems of inequities, I always look for access points. And oftentimes my access points are just recognizing that the person that I'm sitting across from is a human. And oftentimes, regardless of where you're from, you want to feel as if you're being heard and understood, as well as feeling as if you can have this conversation in a place where you belong. And so I operate from empathy and belonging rather than some of these buzzwords, because, as you said, these buzzwords can be mistaken or taken out of context, when the reality is, when we're talking about it, it's how can we come together to look at this practice or procedure to benefit all students or all people. And sometimes we'll have to take a targeted approach. because of the inequities within these systems, right? So if we have students who are furthest away from educational justice, by many of the metrics, if not all of them, it's black and brown boys, whether it's from an attendance standpoint, whether it's from academics, whether it's from behavior. And that's not a coincidence. It's part of the system, right, that's been designed. And so it's taking a look at that with a critical lens, but also with a delicate lens, and recognizing that, education at its essence is culture and humanity. And if we don't lose sight of that, I think we can have constructive conversations around some of these hard topics. But I would, I don't always jump right into them. I mean, you have to be able to read the room. But I think that there are points to be made that we just live in a society here, probably now more than ever, where these systems of oppression are rearing their heads. And it's an opportunity to have these conversations, but it's also an opportunity to center and reclaim humanity in these conversations and try to unite. And I'm trying to communicate this without rose-colored glasses, because, this is a time in American history that has been probably the most polar than I've ever seen it. And I think in that space, though, is opportunity for us to have these meaningful conversations.
Well, I think definitely in our lifetime, this is probably the most openly polar that I've seen it. And I struggle with that because I've heard people say that. And my thought is, well, the further you go back in time, it was clearly more polar, right? Every decade back, we're more, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's never been better. The further you go back in time, it's not been better for us, as especially people of color.
Yeah.
But I do feel that sentiment that in my lifetime, this is probably the most polar sense of hope that I've had.
Yeah.
Because I feel for the first time that we're going to regress.
Yeah.
I feel like I've seen progress my entire life.
Mm-hmm.
And now I feel like we're on a tremendous, tremendous backslide, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which comes, segues me into one of the questions that I had for you. Because when you got two extremes, or two very definitive sides, you have one side who will look at you when you're complaining about the current system and you're vying for change, and they'll say, stop complaining, right? Stop asking for handouts, stop complaining.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas your side, and this is where I kind of struggle, is I tell especially the young students, I don't say stop complaining.
Mm-hmm.
I don't like seeing the fight against the system coupled with a pause in the efforts of progression.
Mm-hmm.
So they'll say, well, I don't like the educational system, so I'm not going to school.
Mm-hmm.
I don't like the racist system in our society, so I'm not going to work for this man or this woman, and so forth. Is our generation getting soft? Because we have been focusing more and more on safe spaces and wellness.
Yeah.
Which is important.
Yeah.
Have we lost that urgency that we had in the 50s to the 70s, in like the Black Panther era, where it was, you still have to be militant enough to fight the system as you're in the system, right? Like, don't jump out of the system and leave yourself behind.
Yeah.
You still got to be militant about what your ultimate goals is, if not for you, for the people.
Yeah.
So are we soft, Rome?
Man, that's a good question. My initial thought is this: the rest is just as important as the work. I think if we continue to move about militantly and we're not seeing the change that we need, I think it's okay to pause and rest, because the continuous grind isn't sustainable. And oftentimes in movements of progress, it's folks that look like us that are on the front lines and that bear the brunt of the consequences. And the consequences are exponentially more severe than other folks. And so carrying that weight with the determination to move forward as a people, and facing, a current administration that has reminded us of what America was built on, is, am I diplomatic enough? But I think for our allies and our youth, who are also allies. I have so much faith in our youth. For the ones who don't always have to carry the psychological burden, the emotional burden, and the physical burden, who are able to move forward while we rest, I think it's an opportunity and it's necessary now, because there have been times where we've thought we've had allies until the rubber meets the road, and we've been left to kind of fend for ourselves. And I think now is an opportunity for our allies to carry some water and make some moves. And I think from a youth perspective, just hearing the question makes me feel really old, because I'm like, oh yeah, they're so. But I'm trying to think about when we were younger, we didn't absorb as much information as quickly as the students are now. And I know that it just causes a mental fatigue, it causes a distortion of reality. And I think with all of that, it creates this almost like fight, flight, or freeze. Like, I'm not doing that, or I'm gonna resist. Or, I'm not. I don't want to. I don't like education, so I'm not gonna go to school. The problem with it is, obviously, if you are opposing something, you can't leave a gap. You have to provide some sort of solution. So I think that, instead of creating a binary or a zero-sum game, if there's something that you don't like, as anyone, particularly youth, because they have the energy, come up with something better, propose something better, and be thoughtful about it. And if you can, be altruistic about it. And I think, too, as we're moving into this new era of education and technology, we've got to think about more innovative ways to be militant. I think the protests are impactful. I think that we can add more layers to the way that we demonstrate our objection to injustice. I think it requires the youth responsibility to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So to your point, are they soft? They're definitely not from our era. They are enduring and absorbing, I think, substantially more information than we did. And I think sometimes that perception becomes their reality. And they don't have, I don't think, because of the rapid nature of the information, they don't have the stamina to discern appropriately. And so they end up kind of stuck and resistant, but almost in a way that doesn't provide a solution at times. So
right.
I would say they have some work to do. I don't know if they're completely soft, but yeah.
So what I hear you saying is that if you take 100 80s kids, they could beat the gorilla. But 2025 kids, I don't know. It's up in the air if they can beat the gorilla, right?
Yeah, and man, I think about, we've talked about, technology, and I just came from a thing with Jonathan Haidt where the anxious generation and how, cell phones have completely distorted students' perception of reality, kids' perception of reality, but also has impacted their mental health, leading to anxiety, depression, and we didn't grow up with that. We grew up with go outside, ride your bike until the streetlights come back, and if you have an adventure, you talk about it. And there are these almost like calculated risks that you take that build resilience.
Mm-hmm.
You're experiencing the world as it is in a three-dimensional space, whereas a lot of kids today are experiencing the world as they think it is from a two-dimensional space. And so when they get out into the three-dimensional space, it's a little funky for them. And I think technology, specifically the phones, have a huge impact on that. I think the solution, for schools and to kind of roughen the edges a little bit of our youth today is to really just get outside and lean into the analog elements of life and, have conversations with people that you don't typically have conversations with. And it just it builds that character, it builds that resilience and ability to kind of recognize self a little clearer.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But I guess that's a good point you bring up, because one of the struggles we have right now in higher level academia is the technology aspect. Technology is great because you can disseminate information, you can create training programs that are interactive, that are immersive, and so forth. You have an older generation that tends to be faculty who knows nothing about how to operate them, right?
Yeah.
I've seen institutions struggle with that. But then I've also seen on the flip side problems at dental schools where they've made attendance optional and people don't show up because they figure, well, I can just watch the recorded lecture later on my own time.
Yeah.
Or you'll see webinar-based things, and I'm literally, when I kid you not, we might have information sessions on dental school, and there's people tuning in with their camera on, laying in bed,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I'm just like, you're laying in bed on,
Yeah.
so I miss the analog days. I miss the days where your presence, your participation, and your human to human contact was a mandate. Do you feel like we're going too far into the all digital, all virtual world?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think for me, learning has always been a verb. And I think that what we're seeing as now, especially in these two-dimensional spaces, it's kind of this amorphous, like blended experience, right? You've got students who are laying in the bed, listening to a lecture. What are we doing, right? And so they're not like fully present, and oftentimes the space kind of informs how you interact with it, right? And so if you're laying in bed and still trying to learn, you're distorting that experience. I think too, I'm going to take us back to grad school. There's this, Vygotsky called it the zone of proximal development. And it's this space between not knowing and wanting to learn, not knowing and wanting to know. Like it's this, you're engaged enough to be curious and figure out the answer to a problem.
Mm.
And what that typically does is not only strengthen your ability of understanding, but it also creates a window of innovation and creativity. What we're seeing now is that that space of potential is being filled with AI, right? So anytime there's like an element of discomfort in the learning, you can just click on AI and get the answer and get a beautiful response of whatever you're looking for. And so that in itself distorts outcomes because it stymies the ability to create and innovate. And then it also creates this dependency on a tool that isn't teaching you how to learn, but it's teaching you how to find what you think might be the answers. And so I think the pendulum has swung too far. And to your point, it reminds me of back in the day when there was a huge initiative for iPads and one-to-one in every room. And it was great, and it was glossy and beautiful, but 80% of the teachers who received these technological tools didn't know how to turn them on, right? And the kids are super intuitive, you know what I mean? And here we are again, but the impact is so much stronger because it's not only an internal tool, it's also a shifter of cognition. And so the AI, where it is now, which is so powerful, we don't have a handle on it, and it's moving so rapidly that the dependency upon it within our students, I think, is irreversible. And so I'm at a place where I'm not sure what we do with that. It's easy to say let's use it as a tool because it's supposed to be like your agent and it's supposed to help you learn things. Easier to say when you're an adult and you have a fully developed brain. But if you have students who are middle school to college who are still kind of developing their style of learning, can't discern between what a really thoughtful essay is or response is because AI is doing it for them. And so I'm not sure what the outcome will be, but I predict that it's going to stymie critical thinking if it hasn't already. I think it's going to stymie creativity and innovation from just the human mind. And I don't know yet. Am I supposed to have all the answers?
No. We just
Where this leads education, because behind the tool of AI is the monetary aspect of capitalism, right? And so that's another beast. And so,
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this real quick. Let me share this.
yeah.
Here we go. Let me know if you can see this. So I was looking at the PISA scores and how
Mm-hmm.
we do compared to other, developed nations.
Yep.
And I want to say when I counted this, we were like 18th out of 65.
Mm-hmm.
And, the top five are all Asian countries, and then
Mm-hmm.
the rest, I think, are all like Nordic countries.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that this is accumulation of critical thinking, math, um, was it critical thinking, math, language arts, and so
Yep.
forth.
Yep.
And we talk about education all the time. It's a political football. It's a dinner table conversation that we have. What's the best way to educate our kids? What should or shouldn't be in the curriculum?
Mm-hmm.
In the meantime, we seem to always not be number one despite being one of the richest countries in the nation, right?
Yeah.
And we have all this technology at our disposal. It doesn't seem to be. So what are these countries doing? I'm assuming at some point you've, whether it's through your graduate studies or your travels, you've kind of
Yeah.
looked at what other country, what educational models they have. What are we not doing right to where we're still lacking disproportionately to our resources that we have?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there are several things. I think we don't value education as much as we say we do. I think if we did, we would pay teachers more. I think that just from a cultural aspect would signal that we are invested in education. So I would start with paying our teachers more. I think second is there's still this standardization of a one-size-fits-all approach to learning. And we, even with the scores that you've shown me today, show that that's not the best approach, right? And so if we pay teachers more, it gives them enough leverage and resources to, for lack of a better phrase, but it's an educational term, like differentiate instruction to support students in the ways that they need to be supported. And I would also challenge the standardization of education. I know that we have to produce metrics, and there's such value in math proficiency, organizing an essay in a way that fosters critical thinking and demonstrates critical thinking. I think that we just need to have a series of new initiatives that change the standards of education and how students are being assessed. I think we need to really invest in education and start by paying our staff more. And I mean, it's hard for education to not be political. If we're looking at the Department of Education, who's in charge there, that's very suspect.
Right.
And the thing too, though, is if there's an argument to be made, it goes to show that the Department of Education could have always done more and could have invested in their commitment to education in better ways. And I think because we didn't, we're left with what we have now. I also think because we are kind of the shining beacon of, of the world, there's not a sense of urgency that we see in other countries, Japan, China, Switzerland. And I think part of it's cultural, but it comes back to our perception of what we think education should be here in America and what we actually value it to be. I think we just don't value it as much as we should. And it shows and it trickles down and we can feel it. Yeah, and we can get into the weeds about COVID. We can get into the weeds about certain regions of the country not being in alignment with the rest of the... There's a lot of fissures within our public educational school system. And then, you have charter schools and independent schools that have it, so it's really complicated, but I think just culturally we don't value education like we say we do.
Right. And I will definitely echo that, because even if you look at our national budget, well, we spend 50 times more than the next largest military. Mm-hmm. But yet those countries are outperforming us in education, which leads to and they're putting in national investment or investment of national funds into infrastructure for education, technology, and industry. Mm-hmm. So they're becoming much more vital on the world scale, and we just got the biggest guns.
Yes.
You know what I mean? Which is absolutely we could literally cut the military budget in half and put it in, and not to say that throwing money at a problem is the fix, but you're right. The fact, I'll give you an anecdote from my history. My brother worked for AmeriCorps for 2 years, and he was at Jason Lee Elementary. It was a high need I think they've renamed it now to like Tacoma Heritage Elementary, but he was part of this college prep course for, I don't know, it was 6th graders, 7th graders, I don't remember what it was, but he had me come in and talk to them. And then after my talk about dentistry, we did what's called a handshake of the day. And literally they all lined up, they had to introduce themselves, give me a firm handshake, and then tell me what about my talk resonated with them. And when I tell you, hands down, out of these 30 plus kids, everyone resonated with my story of growing up with my alcoholic, abusive father that eventually left. Mm-hmm. And then they would tell me a bit about their story. And I was almost like I had to hold back tears by the time I got to that 30th kid.
Yeah.
And in my head, I'm thinking, hey, I don't see how one teacher can handle 30 students. Right? So even if it's not paying teachers more, you need more teachers. Mm-hmm. So that ratio is a lot more manageable, right? Yeah. Then also pay them more. But they're also dealing with these highly traumatized kids. Yeah. Who have food insecurities, who are in foster care, who are in abusive households. Yeah. And that school might be their only escape. Yeah. And it's not that it's their escape to, I'm going to go here and I'm going to be the best version of myself. Mm-hmm. It's also their kids. And so all that trauma is going to manifest during that school day. Yeah. And I left traumatized because those stories just hurt me so bad to know that that's what your average kid in the heart of South Tacoma and the Hilltop area is going through. Yeah. So I agree with you 100%. Our values, especially with how it's reflected in our budget, they're not reflective of what we say.
Right. Right. Yeah. And to your point, there are so many students who see school as one of their basic needs being met. Whether it's shelter, you have students who are unhoused, they get their meals there. And, absolutely, the teachers absorb that trauma, and it creates this, it's almost like a trauma bond where, you're not only asked to deliver high-quality instruction in a timely manner, you're also, asked to teach the whole child, which I am 100% in support of, but it is also absorbing these students who are high needs. And, the challenge with teachers and teaching is that you can't just turn it off when you leave the campus, right? And so it's you think about this, and we talk about having more counselors and therapists for students in school buildings. I would propose those resources for teachers as well, right? It's it's the old analogy of putting the oxygen mask on, when you're on the plane, so you can help yourself, so you can help others. And so there are a lot of challenges in public education, but I think there are a lot of opportunities for solutions and innovative thinking to support not only teachers, but just our value system toward how we see and engage education globally or broadly.
Right. Let me share this video, and not to put you on the spot, because I am so proud of my friend, because he was on a TED Talk platform, which we all can jump on YouTube like I'm doing right now, and now I got a platform, right? But TED Talk is a legitimate platform. So I'm hoping the audio grabbed when I screen grabbed this. So
Okay.
let's check this out real quick.
Poetic or pragmatic, we guide our boys to a more holistic version of masculinity that includes both and. As Bell Hooks and Olga Silverstein said, we need men who are empathetic and strong, autonomous and connected, responsible to self, friends, family, to community, and capable of understanding how those responsibilities are ultimately inseparable. And from a purely academic.
So obviously, anyone that's watching this, I implore you, go check out Jerome Hunter's TED Talk on YouTube. But in that segment, you were talking about the issues of kind of these binary options, right? Are we going to be masculine in the kind of stereotypical sense, or are we soft? Is there no middle ground? Are we one thing or the other? In the Seattle School for Boys, I know you've tried to revolutionize how we look at those traditionally binary options, right?
Yeah.
And especially since you might have students that have those outside of the school issues at home or their upbringing and so forth. How have you navigated that space of reaching those kids in ways that's not quite traditional as far as those topics go?
Yeah, I mean, the philosophy is rooted in that bell hooks quote where we look at it as a binary. Either you're strong or you're weak, or you're hard or you're soft. And the reality is that it's both. And so what I teach and exercise and model and evangelize is this concept of inclusive masculinity. And we often talk about toxic masculinity, and folks who think about masculinity think it's inherently bad, and I'm not one of those people. I think that it's a good thing, and at its best, it's courage, it's strength, it's protection. We've seen terms such as healthy masculinity and modern masculinity, and they're nice terms, but they don't require any accountability. And for me, the inclusive masculinity is a verb, and it requires accountability, showing up, honoring the traits that we have as humans: tenderness, compassion, discipline, strength. And it's teaching middle school, and I focus specifically on middle school and middle school boys because it's this moment in our lives. It's almost like the last stop where we have these physiological elements, neurological elements, social and emotional elements rapidly just kind of flowing through our bodies and changing. And externally, students are trying to become autonomous but don't yet have the skill set to do that. And so my approach is to apply this inclusive masculinity theory to teaching and learning, so students specifically can normalize communicating how they're feeling. And if you have students who are, I don't know, like still kind of learning their communication traits and communication styles, like, one of the things I like to tell administrators and teachers, like, if we can name it, you can tame it, right? So it's like, I'm feeling kind of funky today. And like, well, what's that about, right? Or I'm feeling kind of angry today. And so what that does is it mitigates these unusual behaviors, right? And so it just kind of helps the whole system. And in addition to that, it's also normalizing, like, you can be really athletic and into sports and enjoy poetry, right? And it's this look at masculinity of honoring both of these things as complementary rather than a duality binary, and seeing that as a strength. Because if we can do that with our middle school boys, it not only helps outcomes for them, but I'm confident that it'll create better outcomes for a generation of men who show up for themselves and their families and their communities. And so it's also like the inclusivity is like just honoring the traits that we inherently have, right? Like, we all want connection, we all want to be loved and to love, and we all want, there's elements of competition that really feed us, and there's elements of discipline that feed us, and strength. And I think having all of those assets allows us to be whole, right? And we've read the studies of covert depression in grown men because they just haven't had the social outlets, or they haven't been able to locate like what's going on with them, and so they escape through sex, porn, alcoholism, you name it, right? And if you get older, right, there's a whole epidemic of lonely men who just don't know how to connect with other people because they just haven't had that experience. And so the essence of the middle school boys is that it's holding that both and normalizing it and teaching it in a way to exemplify the strength of it. It's not, the emotional, social intelligence should never be seen as a liability. I mean, if you ask, I was in a meeting today, talking with some employers, looking to hire folks, and one of the key qualities they're looking for is social intelligence, emotional intelligence, right? And I talk with schools a lot about there's so much value in being able to teach students the skills to, let's say, pass an exam, choose a college, and land a job, right? Those are essential, right? And there's a lot of rigor that's embedded in that. But it's not without the importance of emotional intelligence, where it's being able to choose the right college for you because you know what you're interested in, or being able to keep a job because you know how to interact with the group of people while you're doing a project, right? And so marrying those things that are just naturally together anyway without socializing them out, I think is really important. And I'll end on this part for this topic is we often celebrate bravery, but bravery wouldn't be what it is without the presence of fear, right? But we don't talk about overcoming a fear to do something that's really challenging. And so it's holding those two things together and honoring them both because that's just who we are.
Right. So this is bigger than just, when my son would fall down, or now I got a great nephew that's 7, when he falls down, I'm like, hey, dry them tears, boys don't cry, right? That's not what we mean when we're talking about toxic masculinity. There's clearly room to still have somewhat traditional masculine expectations.
Yes.
And obviously, if you're truly hurt, it's okay to cry.
Yes.
But really what we mean is, you're really not that hurt. I saw you fall. It wasn't that bad. Relax. Right. Okay.
Yeah. And, and some of it is you can discern, they probably want attention, right? Or, and and that's why the communication is really important, right? Because if they can locate what's going on with them, that's that emotional and social intelligence where it's are you really hurt? No, I'm just kind of scared. I don't know what's going to be right. It's one of those things, right? And so if they can name it, it really helps to get to the essence of what's going on, and it also, obviously promotes honesty and all of those things. And so it's that, but there's nuance to it, and it's honoring the nuance too, and it's not sacrificing the traditional elements of masculinity. The only traditional pieces of masculinity that I would challenge in any, I guess, piece of tradition in itself is if it's oppressive and exclusive, right? And so it's that's it, and the other stuff, if it's a tradition that's benefiting you and others, rock with it, and yeah. So
and some would argue that that's not even, to be oppressive is not truly masculine. That's being but however, obviously historically it's been males that have done a lot of that, right? So we're not getting from that. But I think that's important, is to say, hey, you're still defined as masculine.
Yes.
As long as you are, you can be strong, but at times there's going to be things you're not strong at, that if you communicate what you're feeling or what you're thinking, we can work with that. You can have a partner, and you don't have to be strong at everything all the time.
Yeah.
And the reason I like that, and so I'm glad you brought that up, is because I'm foraying into the postdoctoral or predoctoral education, which is a 4-year program to create dentists.
Wow.
Which it's not supposed to be easy. And what I'm running into now with a lot of this generation is they vocalize that something is not easy and then expect it to change. Right? Within the philosophy of how you've developed at the Seattle School for Boys, once someone does vocalize a weakness, an insecurity, a fear, or a hurt, how do you then engage with them when whatever it is that's triggering that is probably not going to change and is probably good for them? A rigorous program, I would argue,
Yes.
is good for you.
Yes.
How do you
Yes.
approach that to say, yes, I hear you,
Hmm.
and this is how we're going to get you to still go up that hill,
Love
despite how
that
you
one.
feel?
I mean, yes. And a framework that I just keep in mind is what you're saying going to get you closer to your objective or further away, right? And I think that when people are scared or nervous or uncomfortable with that, and asking them, like, are you not doing, like, you pulling out of this, is this going to get you closer to where you need to be? And oftentimes it's not, right? I think that in rigorous institutions and programs, that is baked into not only building academic stamina, but resilience. And the communication is fine because it's a recognition of, oh no, like this is some real stuff. But it's not without you doing it. Like you still have to demonstrate that you're committed, because then you can have these other conversations. Like if you're like really nervous about moving forward in this particular phase of the program, like are you as committed as you say you are?
Mm.
And I think that there's conversations to be had, but what I typically keep in mind, and especially for the middle school level, is like, is what you're saying going to move you closer to the goal that you have or further away? And
Right.
these are conversations that, for me, are pretty common and easy to have with these middle school boys, because there's something in them that they want to move forward and closer to their goal. I think as folks get older, it's trickier because they can intellectualize the language better and potential outcomes. But it really boils down to their commitment to why they're engaged in what they're doing.
Right.
And so I hear you. I would like to, would you mind sharing like what you do when you hear that from your students?
Absolutely. I mean, I've had a number of students at all levels, even at postdoctoral levels. I've had a lot of mentees that are trying to get into dental school that I've guided, and first thing I do is I hear them, because if you don't let someone feel heard, you're never going to reach them, right? And then instead of and I'd probably be better at, my wife would probably tell me I'd be better at communication if I did that with our interpersonal conversations. I don't try with my mentees to go fact for fact with them,
Yeah.
because they feel how they feel in that moment, right? And you're not going to rationalize someone out of a feeling in that moment. And then sometimes I'll just let them express it, whether it's text, email, or in person, and I'll tell them that I need to get back to them, because that lets them simmer a little bit as well. And I think whatever it is I say that I do, it's always from the philosophy of, you have an absolute right to a fair journey, but not an easy journey. And I like the fact that you tied it to a commitment level, because sometimes you do have to decide whether this is for you, especially, K through 12 is not optional. We know that.
Right.
But everything, post-secondary absolutely is optional to a degree, but is also very beneficial for most people to pursue those. And they just have to realize that it was probably, if it's hard for you, it was probably hard for others. It was definitely hard for me. And everyone you see in those positions you're aspiring to be had their challenges, had their breaking moments.
Yeah.
All they had that other people didn't was the determination, the commitment, and the discipline to just do what was required.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's the big focus is, you have a right to a fair journey, but no one has a right to an easy journey, because anything worth attaining is going to, you're going to get your bumps along the way.
Yeah, I love that. And, I think as folks get older and recognize those challenges, when they overcome them, those become some of the most kind of beautiful experiences of the journey, right? It's that element of like finding your edge and seeing what happens when you get there. Are you going to push through it a little bit, or are you going to move away from it? That obviously, builds all the character, and it adds value to not only your commitment, but the program that you're in. And it's all, I mean, so necessary. And it's obviously easier to say that after you've gone through the journey
On the other
yourself,
side of
right?
it.
You know, and I love that you just hear them out, because I think in moments of challenge, sometimes it's hard for folks to discern between like feelings and facts, you know, and so everything feels real, and that's fine at the moment, but we still have some objectives to meet. And so I think, though, the active listening is key, and then allowing some time for it to settle in and let the dust settle, and folks to, like students, to regain their footing, you know. But the challenge is the beauty of it, right? It's that beautiful struggle through it all.
You know, and sometimes you have to remind people of truly how resilient they are. And I know,
Yeah.
you know, in a lot of spaces that I'm in nowadays, resiliency has become an unfavored word, because a lot of institutions will rely on your resiliency to give you subpar service and education and resource. And you're, oh, they're resilient, they'll be fine, right? So I don't like focusing or building a program off of someone's resilience. But in, like, let's say in my case, because I grew up in Greece with my grandparents, I know a lot of their history, and so I'll look at my grandfather being in a German prison camp, right? Being traded for, like, I think 8 goats, because back then they would take the poor families from the islands would essentially trade their kids into indentured servitude on the mainland of Greece, right? So both my grandparents traded into servitude. He ended up in a German prison camp during the occupation of Greece. My grandmother was homeless during that time. And so I always look back and I say, they survived that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm not, you know, this test is nowhere near a German prison camp, right? So
Yeah.
there might be a high stakes exam, there might be a lot riding on it, I might have a lot of pressures on me, I don't want to disappoint my family, myself.
Yeah.
You know, it might be the entryway into a, you know, a program that's going to set me up for life. So yeah, not to say that they're insignificant, but I think knowing your history, your own personal familial history, your cultural history, I try to remind students that they come from a long line of warriors.
Yes.
This happens to be your fight right now, and this is your turn to be a warrior.
Yes.
You know, and that's kind of like my mansplaining of where to tap into that courage and that strength. I feel bad for people that don't have that connection to their family history or their culture, you know?
Yeah, and it's I think it's so powerful to be able to tap into that, because, you know, if you think about it and then reflect on where you are, right? There has to be an element of pride and humility, you know, just knowing that your grandparents endured what they endured, your parents did what they had to do, and then you're here. I mean, and then you're now in this generative phase with your students saying, hey, let's reflect and take a look at this. And I mean, that's just a powerful way to frame challenges and resilience. I also like what you put too earlier about, you know, I guess for lack of it, for like, you don't want to manipulate resilience, because that happens quite often and you get subpar service or less quality. But there is something to be said about tapping into your cultural roots when times are tough. I do that quite often. I'm a good friend with grief, and have, you know, lost loved ones unexpectedly, you know, in moments of transition or challenge. I think back and meditate, and I run, and sometimes in these long runs that are enduring and really challenging, like, I bring them with me, right? And I think, you know, your philosophy and method to support your students in that way adds that human texture that's so necessary in this kind of world of education. I think that, you know, tests, like you said, are hard, they're rigorous, they open doors of opportunity, but it's not without human sacrifice, human experience. And I think all of that needs to be considered, especially when met with challenges. And I think that's such a such a powerful way to communicate with your students, because it's just a reminder. I think we all need that.
Right, right. And I'm glad you brought up running, because you are damn near the most elite runner that I know personally, right? You're out here killing it with these marathons and these mile times, and I am so, and I'm just gonna embarrass you right now because I've got something I want to share. Listen, if there was ever not enough, if you found yourself one day not having enough reasons to hate Jerome Hunter, right? He's tall, he's good looking, he's eloquent, he's successful, he loves the world, he's a compassionate, good person and citizen. But let me share this here. My man, how old are you?
44.
44, and you got a six-pack like that. I cannot stand you, bro.
This guy's doing his research.
So that's a little fan service, as they say in the anime world, or anyone watching on YouTube. But
yeah.
So you are a runner, and I have a history with running. And one of the things I really loved about, and still love about running or training physically, and I want to know if you've used this, is if I know I have a really long test, like a board exam or something like that, where I know I have to be mentally locked in for 2 hours, 3 hours, or more.
Yeah.
I've always liked running, so I'll study, yes, but I also like the developing the mental discipline of doing something that's challenging for an extended period of time. And it doesn't mean I go out there and I'm not running the 6-minute miles that you are, right? But I'll still run at a challenging pace, for my short, pudgy self, right?
Come on, man.
But I'll make sure that I'm just beyond comfortable
Yeah.
for that 1 or 2 hours. And I intentionally use that because I do love to work out and run, but I also I've learned that it trains your mind. Do you ever use that in your, I guess, strategies of reaching your students on how to develop that mental and brain discipline?
Yeah. I'll share. So running for me is fairly new. I started running during the pandemic because typically I would go to the gym, shoot baskets, lift weights, and when everything shut down in the pandemic, I noticed that my mind would race and I would feel anxious. And I didn't recognize at the time that, working out and playing basketball was, partially for my mental health and well-being. And so I took up running, and the first 2 months or so, I hated it. I just knees on the concrete, I'm dragging, and I'm shin splints. I'm running, I'm going through so many different shoes. I'm really close to just hanging them up, right? And this one day, I think I'd probably run 3 miles, and something mentally clicked, where it was, I had kind of noticed that I was ruminating on a thought. I think it was just, the world was burning. This was probably summer of 22 or 2020. And something just clicked. It was like a moment of Zen clarity that I think sometimes folks call it the runner's high. But that was the moment that I was like, oh, I get it now. There's this mental shift that becomes meditative. There's a calm for me. And so I took that and I guess leveraged that feeling to get into that space of discomfort more and more. And ran with the discomfort while also kind of processing my thoughts. And it's now become twofold, pushing up against my own edges, whether it's distance running or for speed, while also being very present about what my process is mentally in these activities. And so recently I ran the Austin Marathon. It's with an AU, not BO, but it's just the Austin Marathon. Very entry level. And the mental process for me was to break it into 4 parts. And the first part is to kind of do a systems check for the first 3.5 miles. How am I feeling? Conserve the energy. Are there any kind of lingering twinges, pains? If not, if we get to miles 4 to 8, let's pick it up a little bit. I chose, and I'm kind of scouting like the pack, and I was looking ahead probably 500 feet, latched onto that pack for 4 miles, and so it's like I'm now using a little more energy. And then the third kind of leg, I'm really like pushing, and I'm like now I'm like leveraging speed. And then the fourth kind of portion of the marathon, and I'm probably at mile 19 now, and this is where I'm leaning on my ancestors. So I'm like, my hips are starting to burn. My edge, I'm feeling all of the edges around me. I'm like, oh, here we go. And so it's mentally digging deep, but it's also, emotionally digging deep. So I brought my loved ones with me on that, and they kind of carried me through. And so I teach elements of mindfulness to administrators, teachers, and students. I use just like I call it a mindful minute. And it's, whenever you enter a space, just taking a moment to kind of shed whatever you brought into the space, or at least file it in your mind and be present for where you're at, like kind of you are where your feet are, right? And I find it helps students with their anxiety. I find that it helps teachers kind of just take a moment of pause, even if they've had a long day, and something to build from, because like I think from a physiological standpoint, there's evidence that shows just a cadence of mindful breathing can lower cortisol levels and reduce stress. And so I believe that mindfulness is so critical in everyday life, but like teaching and learning as well, because we can sometimes maybe going back to some of the challenges that students face, that it's hard for them to discern between like perception and reality. And I think mindfulness can help you tap into the reality of things. So running's really helped with that. And I would say now I run more for mental clarity than, the photo might say otherwise, than vanity, but like it's really, if I am not running at least 4 times a week, I can kind of tell. And so I think that there's some benefit and opportunities for education to lean into mindfulness. I know folks are doing it more, education's doing it more, but it really does have its benefit.
Yeah. Well, listen, brother, I know I've occupied a fair amount of your time, and I'm always honored. I truly feel it's a privilege when, whether they're friends or not, anyone not only gives me an hour of their time, but really dives deep into what they feel, what they do, what they know. So I appreciate you coming on here. Is there any way or anywhere you want people to be able to find either you, the work that you do, or the Seattle School for Boys, in case anyone in your area is interested in enrolling their children?
Yeah, my website is jeromelehunter.com. It'll give you access to all my resources, contact information, and happy to connect. I often stand at the intersection of education and you name it, and so would love to connect. And I really appreciate you holding space for me to share my experience and my truth. And it's a good way to end the week, and I appreciate just your thoughtfulness of your questions. It allows me to go deep and to share, and so kudos to you, brother, and couldn't have asked for a better interview, so thank you.
Hey, I appreciate that, man. We'll do this again pretty soon, hopefully.
Yeah.
But for anyone listening, I will put Jerome Hunter's website in the show notes. We are the Northwest, you're such a gem of the Northwest, and I love and I am elated just watching your story and what you're doing, brother. So to our listeners out there, my parting words: keep reading, keep listening, keep learning, and we'll talk to you soon.